Hello YouTube, this is the second and final video for my MiG-21 build. The MF variant is the export version, which the Soviet Union basically sold to every country that could afford to buy one, which works out great for us modelers since there's a lot of markings to choose from when you look at building it. I've built the SM variant, which was the Soviet version that they kept at home, and it had an upgraded radar as compared to the MF. Since the radar is hidden in the nose cone, I will display it as a lead fishing weight, and the exterior will come out looking exactly the same as the MF version. The MF designation does not stand for the classic American acronym that you think it does, but is a Russian abbreviation, which means the plane is modernized and has an upgraded afterburner engine. I'm going to fly through the cockpit segment because it's already been heavily detailed in the first video I made. If you haven't seen it, make sure to check it out after you finish watching this video. It's in the description below. The engine on the MiG is mostly hidden once the plane is fully assembled, but if you bring a flashlight and shine it at the right angle and look very closely, you'll be able to see all the detail I'm working on here. I played around with some of the coloration on the outside of the engine since it's completely hidden in the end. This is a good way to practice and experiment with various techniques, which is what I was doing here. Also, the interior of the wing is another good place I like to experiment. The instructions say to put the engine inside the fuselage before you close the halves, but I didn't want to do this quite so early in the build, so I cut out one of the guide ridges so I could slide it in later. And here then I'll test the slide technique to make sure that I could actually get it inside once everything's all put together. You're looking at the inside of the wing where the landing gear connects. I've already gloss coated this piece prior to panel lining and oil brushing. Rather than wait to the end of the plane, once it's all fully assembled, I finished off some sections like this before assembly since they would be very difficult to reach if I waited till the end. Inside the nose cone, you can see my scratch-built radar, which is specific to this model aircraft, the SM variant. It's made up of lead fishing weights. Unfortunately, the instructions didn't say how much weight to add, so I just crammed as much in as I could. But safe to say, if you add 0 grams, then you will have a tail sitter. Earlier on, I deliberately left the engine out of the fuselage so I could slice off the exhaust and get rid of this ridiculous seam line. The 1/72nd version has a separate piece, but the 1/48th scale, it does not, so I purchased a separate resin part from Quickboost so I could just glue that on and eliminate the seam line. I was definitely surprised when I saw raised panel lines on the drop tank. After a quick bit of research, I found that these are intentional and meant to simulate the welds on the actual tanks. Still, it was a challenge to remove the seam line between the two halves without sanding over the raised edges. So I had to go slowly and carefully with the hobby knife and sandpaper. Now I'm using a darker color, like the all-clad steel, to add some shading on the ridges and fins of the drop tank. The landing gear is possibly one of my least favorite sub-assemblies to put together on these aircraft. That goes for most planes, not just this one. I don't know, I just find it hard to get excited about the landing gear when there's engines and rockets and the cockpit that could also be built. Leave me a comment below if you feel the same way or not, or let me know what your least favorite part to build is. Once the mixture dries, it'll look like this, and it'll be very fragile. I'll brush away the excess with the dry brush before setting it in place with the pigment fixer. Here is the wheel well, which I've already airbrushed with XF22 RLM gray, and I'm painting the photo etch hoses, which I have already attached. I frequently superglue small parts to toothpicks so that I can airbrush them. Just use extra thin superglue so that it dries quickly and you don't have to hold it there for a long time. And make sure you attach a section of the piece that will not be visible in the end. Here is another example of all the parts I attached to toothpicks for painting. Wheels, rockets, pylons, landing gear. etc., etc., etc. This tacky stuff is great for getting a feathered edge on the camo pattern and really doesn't leave any residue marks when you pull it off in the end. Once again, I wasn't thrilled with how my mixed colors looked on this plane. Looked a little too yellowy and orangey, so I dumped them back in the container and adjusted the color so that it was to the ratio that you see in the caption below. Also, my camera setting is making this much more yellow than it really is. I fixed that in the next few frames. Yes, I realize the irony of using NATO green, but it can also go along with the Luftwaffe light blue that I used on the underbelly. Regardless of the names, these colors seem to be very close to what the instructions called for and what little reference photos I could find. As you can see, I've managed to cover up most of my pre-shading, so here's a lesson in post-shading, which is technically just pre-shading because I'm going to come over it with another coat of my camo pattern. I've got flat black thinned about 10 parts to 1. I'm using a 0.19 millimeter brush, and it's also impossible for me to airbrush in a straight line, which doesn't matter since I will be spraying over it again with my tan and green colors in a minute. I'll use a piece of cardboard that's left over from every photo etch set that you ever buy to help protect the camo pattern from overspray. I'll hold the cardboard a few millimeters above the model so that I don't spray a hard edge and I keep the feathering effect. I used 3 shades of all-clad to make the multi-tone on the engine. I start with the darkest, which was steel, and then moved lighter to the pale burnt metal. Eduard provides 1,000 tiny decals to label every panel on this airplane, but don't be intimidated by the sheet because you'll have many leftovers since they provide multiple languages and colors and spares depending on which version you're building. Nonetheless, they still took forever to apply. As always, I used lots of microset when positioning the decals, and then used either microsol or solvaset once I had them in place. I wanted to compare both products since they serve the same purpose, and in the end I really couldn't tell much difference between the two of them. They both worked well. Sometimes I'll slice the decals along the panel lines if they're not sinking in like I want them to. My goal here was to fade out some of the decals since they seemed too pristine in color, especially the white on the shark's mouth. The kit came with a couple canopies, which was very handy for protecting the cockpit from the airbrush. So I glued the spare one down with PVA glue so that I could easily remove it later. I also used the spare canopy to bend the copper wire into the shape I needed. I left it taped overnight, and when I pulled the tape off, the wire held its shape and was molded perfectly. I scratched up the canopy a lot when I was trying to get it taped on there, which is a good reason to use the spare one that's included. Then I taped it in place on the actual canopy while I glued it in with PVA glue and let it dry overnight. Towards the end of the build, I start using PVA glue on certain parts because it's easy to wipe off the paint and it won't react and smear the paint like Tamiya Extra Thin or Super Glue will.